Hello and welcome to another episode of Outsuit. Today I have my good friend Hal Clark with me, and together we're going to explore some of the changes that he has experienced through his many decades of IT management work. Welcome to the zoo, Hal.
Oh, thanks a lot, Alf. Good to be here. Finally, have a chance to talk with you on topics like this.
Yeah, I always thought somewhere in the back of my head that we've done this. You and I have been working closely together, so it's almost strange that you haven't been in the zoo yet. But I'm so glad to have you here. So let's jump right into it. Over the last few decades, we've seen a lot of changes in technology in itself, but more interestingly, in how we manage technology. It wasn't always as rigorous as it is today, because it wasn't always as IT intensive as it is today. But what I'd love to hear from your standpoint a little bit, especially for IT workers,
hmm
how has things changed over the last few decades? How have you seen it turn? Is it a huge change? Is it fundamental, or is it just incremental?
I think in general, Alf, think about it more as being incremental changes. I mean, obviously, the business objectives that drive the need for managing IT better are fundamentally the same. Those really haven't changed a lot. Um, and to a certain extent, we think that we depend more on IT, but in my experience, a lot of companies, particularly those that were technology oriented, have been pretty IT centric for quite a long period of time, even if they didn't realize that. From that standpoint, I think the scale of operation has definitely increased. I think enterprises expect more from IT. And because they've grown in terms of the scope of the infrastructure they're managing, they're coming under a lot more scrutiny, for instance, financially, in terms of what they need to do. They're becoming, more involved in governance types of policies than they ever were. So they've become a lot more, I guess, equivalent to other long-term organizations within enterprises like finance have been, right, like sales have been, for
Mm.
instance. So they're managed more professionally in that sense, and that probably has a lot to do with some of the issues that IT has to address, and that's driven some of the changes in how IT operates. And we could be, in the beginning, you could be a lot looser, a little bit of the cowboy, if you will, coming in
Yeah,
and doing things from that standpoint.
yeah.
But one of the key things I think that's changed along the way through this period of time is that fundamentally we managed technology. Decades ago, we were a lot more oriented to people specializing in dealing with a server or dealing with networks, right? And we've developed a lot of specialization even within the software platforms and applications, databases, for instance, and a lot of that knowledge, at the time at least, didn't seem like it transferred. Right? If you step back a little bit, if you were dealing with managing services from the business perspective,
Mm.
right? Take in the days when I worked in the cable business, for instance, we were introducing new automated ways of managing the cables, the cable channels that were enabled on a set top remotely, as opposed to having to go out and kind of flip switches to figure out or put filters on the line and things like that. Well, it really got to be interesting is how they integrated that into their sales process with customers to be able to set that up and do it. So the technology changed, the way we went about doing it changed from that perspective, but it still was very focused in a particular technology area, and only a few people ever really thought about it from the top at that point in time. What I think has happened is that this whole approach to thinking about the real issue, take the case again of the cable companies, right? Their real business is providing this service of enabling entertainment channels to their customers, turning them on, turning them off based on what the customers are willing to pay, and trying to maximize the revenue they could get from that with the least amount of cost to do it. From that perspective, right? They could, because the tasks were relatively simple, you could think about it in terms of these specializations. But as the services have gotten to be more complex because of regulatory requirements, because of additional process issues, all right, if you really take a look at automation, for instance, automation is never a fixed proposition. It's always you're always automating stepwise. All right, let's look at what can we better do today that we couldn't do tomorrow with automation, and once we get comfortable with that level, then we go looking for what's the next opportunity, right?
Yeah.
So you continue to improve and evolve, and that's led to a lot of complexity from that standpoint. So from the IT worker perspective, the ability to actually see what's going on across the entire enterprise has become of greater value. To stay sort of tied in your silo is not necessarily the best career outlook for what you want to do today. And there's certainly people in IT who still hold on to those types of older approaches from that standpoint, but their real opportunities are if they're looking at let's take the first step. How do I get a little bit better at what I'm doing in my particular arena by understanding how that affects the rest of the world? Back in the early days of what we think of as mobile phones, it was called cellular in those days and still was analog, wasn't even digital, right? They had a fundamental problem, because every system was implemented in every franchise that the government had sold off, was operated independently, but yet the huge advantage of mobility is you can move around the country. Well, the early systems had no ability whatsoever to understand if anybody was actually a valid customer, had no way of understanding, or even collecting money for the services that they were doing, because the home system was the only entity that billed you as a cellular customer, still do to this day, from that perspective. And so there was a real issue, and part of it was the solution was an application, and part of it was a network that interconnected the switches. And the more that we were able to connect the business of the network, as it will, to the application, the better the business outcome actually was in terms of how the processes worked. One of the things we're able to do in that period of time is recognize some of the technology changes that might happen in the network business that would affect the overall business. And for instance, the move towards higher level signaling protocols within the switching community and what that meant to business reporting, for instance, turned out to be a significant capability that when we implemented it, in essence, kind of saved that business, because otherwise the company that I worked for would have been cut out of the stream of information, as it were, from that standpoint, and our key customers would have lost their ability to report on how their business is operated. So some of those types of things began to become important, and if the only thing you're worried about is, whether this router or this switch or something like that, if that's all my job is, right, I'm not really going to promote my career, much less the success of the enterprise or company that I'm working for. Yeah. So it's a lot more tied together these days. We talk about it as service management at this point, but in a lot of cases it sounds like it's just lip service, because we're not tying all of those particular pieces together. So that I think is one of the most significant shifts that has happened, is kind of bringing all of these technology specialists out of their silos, right, and beginning to function like they are really coming together with all of the aspects that it takes to accomplish what the end user ultimately is trying to get. In the case of mobile networks, I want my phone to work wherever I get off the airplane to run. I don't want to have to worry about having to log into different systems, right, or having somebody have to figure out, whether I'm a valid customer or not. Any of those things, I want the back-end system to take care of that, right? All I'm looking for is I want to use my mobile phone wherever I happen to be, right? And some of the systems that you can get on today, I can go any place in the world. I don't have to call anybody. I don't have to do anything. I just turn my phone on and boom, all of this stuff happens.
So the IT worker have to have a more holistic view, you would say, both across the IT discipline, but also understanding the impact on the business, and that's becoming more critical today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we certainly have had elements of that in the past, but for the most part, what I saw IT workers doing, a few decades ago versus what they need to be doing today, that's the fundamental difference, right? You could focus on just keeping the router up or making sure you had connectivity 20, 30 years ago. Today, you've got to make sure that what you really have in place is all of the infrastructure that's necessary to deliver whatever service is that you're supporting. It's not just the network itself, it's a bunch of other pieces. And you have to be part of that solution and have to understand how that contributes as opposed to just keeping the network up.
Gotcha. What about the end users? How has their relationship with IT changed over the last few decades?
So I think what we just talked about in terms of how IT has changed give you some idea of what's really happening on the user front, right? The users expect things to work, right, in terms of the tools that they get provided from that standpoint. In the early going of IT, yeah, and this is one of the reasons it makes me question why everybody thinks IT is more important today than it was even 30 years ago. You came to work, and yeah, there were tools, IT tools that were provided to you. They were just provisioned to you. You came in, they gave you a login, and that's how you did your work, right? It might be record keeping, whatever the system was that IT was providing. It just was there, right? You didn't think too much about it. From that standpoint, there weren't many other opportunities or options for what you wanted to do, and it either worked or it didn't work. It was pretty straightforward. You didn't need to know a whole lot about what was going on behind the scenes. So that was a pretty simple model, right? But one of the things that happened, those of us that were kind of geeky, if you want to think about it that way, liked all of these automation tools, is, well, if it can make my work better, why can't I use that to save some time in my personal life? Right? And it kind of opened up a lot of market opportunities that companies obviously looking for some revenue, ways to do it. They went out and tried to harvest that particular part of the marketplace for our personal lives, right? And we got a lot of services. Obviously the internet made this sort of take off to a great extent as having this universal connectivity. So it was a great enabling function from that standpoint. But the result was that I can go out and get services that I want by clicking a couple of buttons. Use my personal credit card, all kinds of things. And at some point, it became, these are options that I can leverage pretty easily at home, but demands for what I need to do at work, ever increasing. Right, my boss wants me to do more, every week, every month. The escalation continues because businesses are growing. Right, we all want growth in revenue. It takes additional effort to make that happen, and I have to find ways to become more productive. So at some point, I began to get dissatisfied that the tools IT is giving me aren't keeping pace with what my boss is expecting me to do. In this scenario, and I find out it's actually pretty easy to go out on the internet and find a solution for doing something that I might need to do. Right? I'm start going around IT if they're not going to do it. There's plenty of things that I can do outside, right? And the cost of it is pretty nominal.
So self-service as a wider genre than just application, but self-service in itself has become more accepted by the end users rather than calling for help all the time, do you think?
Well, certainly in our personal lives, there's two ways of thinking about it. This double-edged sword, if you will, right? Self-service gives me some autonomy to do things when, I want to do them. It's not prescribed by the hours a certain business is open. Usually I get faster response because I don't have to stand in line or don't have to wait until somebody's available to do it. So there's some advantages to those of us that want immediate gratification, so to speak. And our expectations have gotten changed a lot by having self-service available. The other side of that is obviously we're expected as consumers to do more of the work that normally we would have had somebody else do, like a bank teller in the past, for instance, or some other service representative to do on our behalf. So there's power in that, there's flexibility in that, but yet it takes a lot more of my time. And to a certain extent, I've got to have some amount of knowledge about what I'm trying to do to express what I'm looking for in appropriate terminology.
So is the average IT user, non-IT user, as I say, so the average regular employee, if you will, are they more tech savvy today than 20 years ago?
I wouldn't say that they were more tech savvy per se. I think they know how to use the tools. I mean, there's a train of thought about what you get used to. I mean, a lot of us joke, those that have kids, for instance, joke about, if I'm having trouble with a remote control or I need to know how to configure this new piece of equipment I bought, just ask your kid, right? They'll know a little more about it than you do.
I wish my daughters are hopeless. I have to fix everything for them.
Well, that's
Come
different.
on now.
Daughters and their dads, that's a different proposition altogether. But the issue is familiarity with a basic kind of logical approach to how things work. I thought it was interesting when iOS 7 came out a month or so ago. One of the guys was having trouble trying to figure out how to turn off apps on iOS 7 because prior to that time, there was a certain way you would turn an app off, for instance, so it's not running in the background all the time, or it's not there to run pretty easily. With iOS 7, it's sitting there running all the time. You want to turn things off so they don't chew up batteries. From that standpoint, he couldn't figure out how to do it. Asked his 12-year-old son. His son said, "Oh, just flip it up, right, and turns it off." He asked him, "How did you figure that out?" So I just played with it until it did what I wanted it to do, right? Talk about a simple statement, right? I just played with it till it did what I wanted it to do, and a lot of this stuff works that way from that standpoint. So we can leverage that type of thinking to get stuff done along the way, but it still takes some of our effort to make that happen. And I think in terms of enterprise self-service scenarios, the problem that we have had for quite a long period of time is that most of the tools that have been presented, go back to this simple scenario that I was talking about before, we didn't need to understand what was going on in IT. The application was on my desk. All I needed to know was how to log into it, and then how the process went, what I needed to enter in a form when. Typically, I didn't have to worry about how do I ask for access. It just was on my desk when I came to work from that standpoint. So now we've got IT's trying to respond to these need for additional tools, right? Additional services. They've built up processes internally they've been using for decades. Guess what? The language that all of this stuff is built in is the language of IT. A bunch of techno geeks, right, that are doing things their particular way. They've developed their own lingo. Those of us out here in the rest of the world, so to speak, outside of IT, are calling things by entirely different names, right? We've probably got lingo that's associated with stuff that's buried in the application that the IT guys have no idea what that is either. So we're both sitting here trying to talk to each other about what needs to happen, and we're using different terminology from that standpoint, and that makes self-service really difficult. So a lot of the self-service tools that IT has thrown out have been things they were using internally that somebody got the bright idea, oh, let's just let our users have access to this, and boom, they can start doing self-service, and we go log in and we go like, okay, what is this? Right? What is this item? What I really want is I want the printer fixed, but okay, which of these 6 different requests is actually going to get done what I need to do? From that standpoint. So the language itself has not been up to par, and I think that's kind of the crux of where we are in self-service right now. Is we're trying to get across this boundary of, from an end user perspective, of trying to normalize our linguistics or leverage technologies that allow us to interact with IT a lot more easily, which we haven't made it across that chasm yet. It's something I think that is evolving. It's driven by the fact that I can do things far easier at home than I can do at work in terms of getting help on certain issues. I know that if I'm having trouble with my iPad, I know exactly how to go get an appointment when I can be available to do that. I don't have to worry about somebody calling me at 2 o'clock in the morning while I'm asleep, because they happen to be in Hawaii or wherever they happen to be, and I'm on the East Coast, whatever the issue is, right? I get it done in my time zone when I'm ready to do it, and that's a big difference in what self-service needs to be truly successful. Right. This goes back to the whole idea that the objectives haven't changed. We haven't really got a solution yet that achieves those objectives effectively.
Going forward, then, how do you think things will change? Will we become even more reliant on the end user to take responsibility in managing their own IT, and IT then take on a different role to become more project oriented, to take a higher level than just break fix engagement? How do you see that play out over the next decade, let's say?
That's a good question. I mean, we have to continue to remember that from the enterprise perspective, right? It's what the employees that are conducting business transactions, right, get accomplished, what their productivity is, which is the highest priority of making things happen. Now, we do have some IT systems that generate revenue as well that you have to sort of put into that camp, but let's just focus on the general user population of employees, for instance. It's really important that they be effective, right? So I think IT is shifting towards really trying to address that particular paradigm and not just the paradigm of how well is the infrastructure behaving today from that perspective. So it's about really whether that end user is able to do their job. So in that respect, I think IT's focus really will change more to what ITIL thinks of as service manager or service management, right? And become more the broker, if you will, for how to enable that end user to be effective. And they're not going to know when an end user needs certain things or anything like that. So from that perspective, the end user still has to be the one in control of when they need something done, right? Or when they need access to applications, or how they're going to go about accomplishing their tasks. So they're going to be in control of that, not IT any longer. That is a shift, right? In a sense, from that perspective. So IT's focus, if you want to think about it from a project perspective, is when they're going around doing continuous service improvement scenario. It's all about what am I going to do, what projects am I going to instantiate and follow through on, right? That actually make the end user able to do their job effectively, as opposed to how do I deliver IT more effectively, is how do I deliver worker productivity more effectively.
Gotcha.
A little bit of a shift, and it's not that different probably from what people thought they were doing, but I think conceptually saying it that way has a broader impact or significance.
Cool. So how's the mood in Boston? 3 rings in 10 years after you went, was it a 86-year drought or something like that?
Well, the drought got broken a while ago.
Yeah.
The one that was broken was it's the first time in 95 years that they won the World Series in Boston, with the Green Monster looking over everything. So I think that was the biggie that everybody was hot on, as well as the fact that it occurred in the same year we had the unfortunate incident with the marathon. So it kind of bracketed the year, as it were, 6 months later to come out with a win in that regard, but then also do the win in Boston. I think it was the.
Yeah, ironically, I was interviewing Lilac Schoenbeck, who's also in Boston,
Yep.
the week of the attack, and we had to postpone because of it. And then I have you now, and sort of, as you said, they almost come to conclusion that whole process. And Boston strong. I think the whole nation was cheering for you for that game. So good luck.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Hal. I appreciate you coming to the zoo. I really enjoyed hearing your perspective of the history of IT. We need to do this more often, my good friend.
Let's do it.
We'll do. The rest of you out there, take care. Stay safe.
Bye. Good day.